immediate socioeconomic response to the COVID-19. My name is Marco Rotelli. I'm ICVA representative for Africa, but I cover also the global portfolio for the Nexus, and this is why I'm hosting this meeting in the global functions that ICVA is covering on the Nexus. Today we have invited friends and colleagues from UNDP and DCO, both based in New York, to support us in understanding the UN socioeconomic framework for the COVID-19. The aim is, first of all, to know more about it, understand its rationale and the way it works, the relevance for NGOs particularly. On the line, there is a wide array of NGOs from different regions and different roles, from headquarters, regional level, and country level. Being an ICVA event, there is also a great diversity, which is very precious and dear to ICVA. The meeting will be set in basically two sessions. The first will be hosting George Gray Molina, who is the head of strategy and policy engagement and chief economist in UNDP in New York. The second will be hosted by Frederick Mathis, which is Chief of Policy and Innovation in UNDCO, also based in New York. Please remember to keep your mic mute. I see that everyone is muted in this moment. Thank you very much. And to post any question or anything you want to raise on your on the chat box. I will do my best to try to moderate and to read the chat. The chat. In case you see me delaying this, please make sure you notify yourself, even taking the floor when there is an opportunity. I think this is a unique opportunity for us to have these two guests, and the more engagement, the more we engage, and the more vibrant we can make this meeting, the better we will understand as NGO what it is all about. I shall also say that thank you also to the availability of the two guests. This meeting is being recorded for a double purpose of having some notes, the capacity then to take out some notes, but also to be available for people that weren't able to join us today. So it is my great pleasure to invite George Gray Molina as the first guest to introduce us to an overall overview, basically, on the socioeconomic framework. George, if you hear me well, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Marco. It's a great pleasure to be here. What I will do is I'll share a brief presentation. I have a brief PowerPoint, but I think perhaps the most interesting or important issues will be covered in the questions and answers. So feel free to interrupt and also make any questions at any time. Let me try to share the screen right now. So I'll open up.
Yes, affirmative. We can see your screen. Thank you, George.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me go back. There we go. All right, so let me get started. As you know, the socioeconomic framework was rolled out since April 27th this year. I had the good fortune of being part of the drafting team. It was 14 UN agencies working together over a couple of weeks to put together something that transcended both the health perspective, but also the economic perspective that had dominated the early discussions in the G20, the IMF, and the World Bank. So as you can see from the 5 pillars and the 5 streams of work that were pulled together, they cover a vast array of issues. One, of course, that has to do with health systems beyond the COVID response. Second, a whole pillar on social protection and basic services. Third, a pillar on jobs and incomes in small and medium enterprises and supply chains. Fourth, a pillar on macroeconomic, both fiscal and financial flows. And finally, a pillar on social cohesion and community resilience, including rule of law, governance issues, social contract. Let me situate where we are right now. We've, since over the past 45 days, we have been working in 130 countries on the rollout for this socioeconomic framework. We are now at a moment in which COVID has not plateaued. If you take a look at the latest information from the World Health Organization this week, we're still at 137,000 new cases and still growing. The epicenter has moved to Latin America right now. So we can foresee a long COVID season yet. We have been working on collecting data from countries around the world. We've collected 63 socioeconomic impact assessments over the past 45 days, and we have a pipeline of 120. So what I'll show you over the next few slides comes from the 63, from which we've been learning about different issues, things that are the focus of the socioeconomic rollout. Maybe just one brief issue that's worth describing is that the socioeconomic framework, unlike the health or the humanitarian appeals, is very much a bottom-up process. So there's 160 offices, resident coordinators with UN teams. They prepare their own response plans and they prepare their own socioeconomic impact assessments. There are no templates. There is an interest in aligning to those 5 pillars and also to government COVID response plans. But unlike the humanitarian and also the health appeals, there's no centralized either funding nor guidance, if you will, from headquarters. So what we have is more of a decentralized, bottom-up response on the socioeconomic side. That's how it was designed, and that's how we're rolling with it right now. What are the assessments saying over the first few days or 45 days? The number one issue that we see reported has to do with jobs, incomes, livelihoods, small and medium enterprises, informal sector workers. So under the economic recovery pillar, we have most of the demand right now, both for forecasting, but also for needs analysis. As you can imagine, the very first assessments are mostly ex ante impact assessments. So they're using forecasting, scenario planning, projections. But over the past couple of weeks, we've been seeing more in-depth treatment of both livelihoods and jobs, as well as social protection, which is the second issue that is in high demand. Social protection for those covered by social assistance and social insurance, but especially those who are not covered, so meaning informal sector workers, people not covered currently by programs. And I'll get into a little more detail a little later on that. Those are the two big ones, but of course we see a variety of interest, including health and including social cohesion and community-based resilience program. How are these assessments designed and how are they written up? They're done in companionship and partnership within the UN first, but also working with IFIs on the ground, notably the World Bank and regional banks, as well as some private sector, some academic partners, civil society, NGOs. As we look forward and we think about the long haul, what we're trying to visualize is what this looks like, which is a U-shaped recovery path, and what it's trying to signify is that we have a process of very uncertain data in the very short run, and this includes uncertainty about health issues, but also about poverty, incomes, economic growth, and other projections. We see 3 types of choices being made by governments right now. Some are the urgent choices that have to do with containment, partial, full, and that have to do with the health and logistics of both food and medical supplies. So we've been following and monitoring the urgent choices, but there's also a set of no harm and no regret choices, which focus mostly on rights-based and leave no one behind initiatives. And the third set of policies that we've been covering are strategic choices, things that build back better, that link us to a longer-term recovery. In a report that we just released about a week ago, we focused on 7 tipping points, what we call tipping points over the next few months or years. And these are longer-term issues, things that could change the shape of sustainable development over the next few years. The first of which is new social contracts, changes in social expectations and political expectations coming out of the pandemic and the crisis. The second has to do with gender equality and a move on many fronts on gender, starting with gender-based violence, but not limited to that, focusing also on economic empowerment and political empowerment. Three, a green recovery, the potential for a green recovery, changes in oil prices, changes in procurement pathways for governments, and also a signaling to build up uncoupled carbon pathways of economic growth in the future. We also see a lot of interest in digital reboot, the use of digital solutions and tools for teleschooling, telemedicine, and so on, which could really change the workforce, which could really change the provision of services in the future. And then we do see some shifts in multilateralism and what this means for the UN system, but more in general for how we approach development. One of the most worrisome issues on our radar is debt. And also I'll talk about that briefly because it's an issue of major concern. As we take a look at the SDG indicators, what we find is an SDG regress. So our colleagues from ILO, from World Food Program, from UN Women, us at UNDP, we've been estimating and projecting and forecasting what we see on the SDG side, and it doesn't look good. We knew that we were off track before the COVID crisis, but we now see evidence of a profound regress that will take years to get over on different fronts. Let me dive a little deeper into that. One issue that we're focusing on right now this month is the question of basic incomes. And this is coming from many, many countries who are either expanding their social protection programs or thinking through how to reach those who are not covered by social protection, specifically informal sector workers, which sum up to 2.1 billion workers right now. So we've been doing simulation work with 162 country data to find out what it would take to create a basic income floor, a UBI, if you will, but a temporary UBI for as long as the crisis takes. And we find that a 12-month UBI in 162 countries at $5.50 a day as a top-up is equivalent to the debt standstill for all developing and emerging economies for the same period, for 12 months. As you know, there is a current debt standstill for 73 countries, IDA countries, but it only covers official creditors. So the sum total of that standstill is $45 billion, whereas the amount that 160 countries will be paying this year in debt service is 2.9 trillion, excluding China. So as you know, the Secretary General has called for a debt standstill for all developing countries from all sources and all creditors, including private sector creditors, multilateral development banks, non-traditional creditors. So this is something that's on the agenda. Unfortunately, we do see a lot of debt distress coming into the COVID crisis, and of course, the need to respond will build up debt over the next few months and years. G20 countries have invested between 10 and 12% of GDP on the fiscal response and between 6 and 8% on credit lines. So that's about 20% of global GDP, whereas developing countries have invested about between 1 and 3% of their GDP on the fiscal and financial response. So there is a tremendous disparity in the capacity to respond, and this is something that we think will have a grave effect over the response in the medium term. Just wrapping up this economic section, when we look at the projections, we just saw the World Bank's projection last week. The IMF will have new figures coming up on the 24th of June. And what we've seen already is that we don't expect a V-shaped recovery for developing countries. We expect more of a U-shaped, a longer recovery period. The V-shaped recovery was projected by the IMF in February and ratified April data. But now the new data from the World Bank, as well as UNDESA's projections, as well as the OECD projections from last week, suggest that we're entering a much different phase that looks more like a 2-3 year process until we return to where at least income was 2 years ago. So we think that this is going to have a long effect. I know some of us are living in New York, others are living in Europe, and it seems like we're entering recovery. But for 160 countries, that's not quite the case. We're just getting started. On the tipping points issue, this is just to flag the 7 issues that we're looking at. The first is social contract and changes in social expectations, transformations in trust between government and citizens. 2, look at capabilities and how inequalities exacerbated the effects of the crisis, but how it also creates a new focus on universal health and also addressing income inequalities, including universal basic incomes. 3rd, a focus on climate and nature-based solutions and a transition decoupling growth from carbon emissions. 4th, a decisive move on inclusion and diversity, more specifically on gender inequality. 5th, digital solutions, digital disruption for people and planet focused on services. 6, peace, inclusive, resilient systems and processes and institutions and societies capable of conflict prevention. And finally, a new view on multilateralism, including the potential for a green Bretton Woods that would focus on economic and CO2 decoupling. 2 final slides on sustaining peace and peace building. This is a moment of grave challenges, as we know, exacerbated by inequalities that have been ongoing and exclusions and marginalization. There are governments that are restricting civil society spaces and increasing authoritarian measures. There are delays in elections that may have political consequences over the next few months, and there is a proliferation of hate speech in different parts of the world, xenophobia and fear-mongering. So there's a distinct set of challenges on the social cohesion and on peace and peace-building side. But there's also opportunities, some of them emerging from community responses, from local level mutual aid responses, from women and youth peace builders, and from activist movements and organizations. And we're seeing the expansion of digital solutions enter into that space very vigorously and aid what might be a different way of addressing conflict and peace building in the future. Finally, from the UN side, what we see is an important need to focus on state and people on the ground and erosion of trust and the capacity to create local dialogue and national dialogue on issues of importance. As the crisis evolves, we see that the problems shift from the immediate food or medical supply issues onto other issues that I described earlier in the 7 tipping points. There's the support for the Secretary General's call for ceasefire through provision of peace dividends, and there is a call to engage in a broad-based coalition of UN partners on the ground, including CSOs and IFIs for socioeconomic recovery. This is all I wanted to share in this brief presentation, but I'm happy to address questions and answers. We're just getting started. This is 45 days into the socioeconomic framework rollout. I know my colleague Frederick will give us more details on how the process is happening on the ground. I just wanted to share with you what we're seeing from the first socioeconomic impact assessments in these 45 days. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, George. Indeed, brief but very, very dense and rich of information. Is striking about the data you're proposing are really striking. And one of my first reactions would be about the SDG regress. And also, as you probably know, this is being a humanitarian network. We have been also very concerned about the repurposing, basically, of funding from the development into humanitarian, which is absolutely needed in terms of response. But there are risks in terms of capacity, particularly on resilience and mid-term development, that we may find a much higher bill and unmet results in the next few years. I don't know if it matches with your schedule, George, because initially we thought to open for questions immediately after each presentation, but probably it's worth going in the in the next presentation from Frederick, and then to try to have a broader. Okay, fantastic. So Frederick, without further ado, I think the floor is yours. And I think we agree that you will guide us a little bit in the rollout at the country, regional, particularly at the country level. So where really the rubber hits the ground, I guess. Over to you, Frederick.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. So thank you, and thank you to George for giving this great introduction. I think it's really important that we started with that socio-economic impact analysis, because that's basically what's going to drive the response plans. And UNDP, we've been working very closely together with UNDP on that, and it's been a great partnership. What George didn't tell is that we actually developed that global framework only in 10 days. And if you know how we normally work, I think it is quite amazing to see that within 10 days we were able to pull off that global framework, which, as I will explain later, actually has been really important to shape what's happening at the country level. Also important to know is that those socio-economic impact assessments are not only important to guide the work of the UN country teams, they're also helping in the development of governments, their national response plan. So an important part. As George mentioned, we're still very early days, 45 days since we launched that global framework. So we don't have that many socio-economic response plans completely finalized. Many are in draft form. And the first conclusion that I would like to give of the first trend that we're seeing is that the global framework actually has helped to frame a robust country team offer. Plans that were prepared before the launch of the framework tends to be not as good as the ones after in terms of policy and program offers. This was very much focused only on health, humanitarian, and less on socioeconomic response. What are the other trends that we're seeing? We see the first indication of some kind of focus on building back together, including entry points for green investments, renewable energy, smart housing, green public procurement, public transport, but more can still be done there. What I think is also a very interesting trend is the focus on vulnerable groups that is present in many of the impact assessment, but also in the response plans. And I think that that's partly to do with the fact that we had a specific chapter in our global framework on vulnerable group and pre-identified vulnerable groups, which of course at the country level then are being refined further. And I think if I can go a little bit off script here, you might know about our cooperation frameworks and our common country analysis, which is guiding the work of UN country teams, in which we have a much heavier emphasis on leave no one behind, that concept, vulnerable groups. And we've seen this really coming through. And I think with the socioeconomic response plans, you really see that coming through, and it's a key element for UN country teams to look at where are those groups that we need to reach first. While most of the impact assessments address macroeconomic issues, we don't see that necessarily coming through completely in the response plans yet. We have a couple of examples. We see that we are working with IFIs, the World Bank and IMF, but there's also still an area for improvement possible. The best plans that we have seen reflect a very broad-based involvement of agencies across the system and buy-in from the government and other partners. And UN resident coordinators play a very strong role in guiding the overall vision and collaboration. And with UNDP, who's providing the technical guidance to shape that socioeconomic response and recovery offer, we've really been able to provide an integrated perspective. What's also interesting to see as a first trend is that we're using existing mechanisms. So it's not that we suddenly have turned around everything, but basically looked at what are the structures, what are the frameworks we already have in place, and that's the first thing that we are using. And in that sense, and you already alluded to that, many UN country teams actually have done some repurposing of programming. We're currently conducting a small survey across our 131 UN country teams, and the sum that we have now is that up to $1 billion has been repurposed. I understand your point that has some risk, but I think it also shows that UN, especially with the repositioned UN, the whole reform process that we started on 1st of January 2019, we're much more agile than we were before. We don't have our strict instruments, and we're stuck with it, even if there is an emergency. So I think I see this personally as a positive thing, and I'm happy to discuss further. Now, what are some of the challenges that we're seeing? First one is, and George already alluded to that as well. In some countries, some governments are more occupied with the immediate health response. For example, procurement of medical supplies, and really thinking on how can we have a good socioeconomic policy response? How can we actually have a plan that's valid for the longer term? Some of those governments are focused on the upcoming elections, using lockdown measures that are disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups. So that's still a challenge that we are facing as United Nations. Second big challenge is that I think the engagement with the IFIs could be further improved. I think we are moving in the right direction. Moving in the right direction in working with IFIs, but more can be done there to ensure that the response of the international community is much more aligned than like separate offers. The building back together, there's some indication in the plans that this is being taken serious by UN country teams. I think we need to think a little bit more further on how we can actually put this in practice. And I would also be interested to hear the opinion of the group here today on how you would see that concept of building back together, so that we're keeping a focus on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs to start with, but actually building a different kind of future, not doing business as usual. Was very interested to hear from George as well about universal basic income. So these are kind of things that we need to think more on and push it at a very large scale. The last challenge that I would mention is the funding, which always is a challenge. I already mentioned the repurposing. There's going to be quite a lot of new money needed to make this happen. There are several initiatives ongoing, and I will talk through them later. But certain groups get some money from the humanitarian community. Others are not included in that. Middle-income countries who at the same time were also hit quite hard are not having the same access to funding. The fact that this is also happening in donor countries all makes the funding unreliable, and we're not quite sure how this will look like in the longer level. That's a little bit, the unsustainability of that will be a challenge that we need to look at. Now, how does this all come together with the other plans? I think first of all, foremost, we got a resident coordinator who brings this all together, and with clear technical leads. The socioeconomic response definitely led by UNDP as the technical lead, and they've played a very important role in that. And UN country teams working together across all the facets of the response, each with their added value, each where they can bring some comparative advantage. The same resident coordinator is also often the humanitarian coordinator. So he or she is that person that drives coherence between the response and the humanitarian interventions. And then lastly, on the health response, it is the resident coordinator, once again, that's coordinating, but with the technical lead of WHO. Now, the immediate reaction you might have is like health, humanitarian, socioeconomic. Does that not overlap? And indeed, it does actually overlap a little bit, but that's actually fine, because I think there are some, like on the health issue, there are some things that really needs to be done right now, and things that we need to build for the future. And the same thing goes with humanitarian. I actually think, and I got my colleague Agnesi online as well, so she can also help me answer some questions afterwards. I actually think it's one of the first time that we are developing a humanitarian response in parallel with the socio-economic response, or a development response, if you want. Because very often we do the humanitarian, and then suddenly we realize, oh, but now we need to think about the medium long term. So the fact that this is all coming together, I actually think is a big change, and future will tell how well we have done this. But I think we're putting some really good building blocks here. Now, each of these three components require extensive resources, and I already mentioned that. So there's different appeals for that. There's the funding for the Global Humanitarian Response Plan. There is the funding for the SPRPs, the response plans on health. And then there is the Secretary General's Trust Fund for the COVID-19 response and recovery, where we hope to have 1 billion by the end of this year mobilized, and we're also setting up some actions with the foundation. There's something going on next week with I think it's the Kaizen Foundation. It's called. We have also other events with Global Citizen being planned in next week to fund the SDGs fund. There's also individual donations that can be given. So I think that's really important. What's really important here as well is, and that goes again about to show how agile the UN is developing. I think the fund was set up in April, and by the end of May, 47 countries already received resources. So that goes from mobilizing resources, looking at the proposals, making a decision, having the whole bureaucratic rounds of getting it approved, into actually allocating the resources. So that shows that we are a UN development system working in emergency mode. And maybe that's a good point for me to stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Very, very interesting. It's also, as we said, is where I think the reality is, where the macroeconomics and the very worrying signals that George was highlighting are actually happening. You underline, while I wait, I give some time to the participants to post questions on the chat box or to ask for the floor, or both. You can of course take the floor to post your question, and you're invited to do so from now. I would like to elaborate, not to elaborate, but basically to maybe pose my first question. And the prerogative of being a moderator is also to be the first probably to pose questions. Is the role of two actors basically. Of course, as you mentioned, so importantly, the empowered RC since the reform of 1st of January 2019, but also the role of the governments, especially in critical contexts where the governments, where there are, for instance, known international armed conflicts going on, and so on. The role, I think, one of the worries from NGOs, depending really on the context, and we know how much contextualization in all the Nexus conversation is so important and prominent, is about inclusivity. And while in general NGOs are satisfied to some extent with the works of the humanitarian IAC side of the equation because of the formalism that allows basically NGOs to be at the table of the HCT and to be a part of the decision-making process to some extent, from the joint analysis to the joint planning and so on. It seems like the reform in a way leads to the discretionality of the RC, the decision basically whether to involve or not NGOs. Now, in times of crisis, in normal circumstances, that could be okay, because anyway, the RC has a number of tools to involve NGOs informally. But in times of crisis, and especially when the crisis overlaps basically between humanitarian and development, as we have seen from both of your presentations, it becomes probably more and more pertinent. I was talking with many colleagues of NGOs in these days, and 45 days in the making of this framework, but maybe 3 months in the preparedness and response for the COVID. Many are saying it is very, very difficult now to distinguish between COVID-related response or response that is to needs that are exacerbated basically from by the effect, by the impact of the COVID, be it by restrictions or by loss of income, etc., etc. So, do you have can you elaborate a little bit on the role of the RC and how you see? Of course, I'm pretty sure you can. You will not say it's a critical, and you are equally scared about the potential for non-involvement of NGOs. But can you reassure us a little bit, basically, of the tools at disposal of the RC to actually and proactively involve NGOs in the analysis and planning processes? Over to you.
Marco, if you'd like, I can start more on the technical side.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, on how we're working on that. I think one of the things that we've been working on with RCs is to think through the theory of change guiding action on the ground. And as you can expect, that theory of change is showing a multi-level and multi-wave kind of intervention. So we'll see this not as a single shock that arrives in a country, but as a continuous wave of shocks that are affecting different parts of society or the economy or different geographies even. So in the theories of change, what we're trying to do is think of the response also to reach out and construct what is somewhat of a timeline, if you will, of reaching out. And that includes, of course, working with a vast array of partners on the ground. So in the very first node, if you will, of most theories of change is the focus on the health and on the immediate medical food supply chain effects that are related to lockdown in the early phase. So that's an early node, and it has a set of partners around it. But as we move further into the crisis, we find that the next few nodes have to do with livelihoods, with jobs, with social protection where social protection is absent, with informal sector workers that are not covered, with migrants, internally displaced populations, mobility that moves beyond the formal constraints set by even the government COVID response plan. So as this moves along, we are encouraging the RC and all of the UN system to reach out to all of the partners who are engaged, and that becomes especially important as we reach out to those most left behind, those who are not inside this formal social insurance or social protection systems in most developing countries. So in a sense, from a technical point of view, the method is to be a revolving and an inclusive process throughout the next 18 or 24 months or however long it takes. But I will defer to Frederick more on sort of the institutional side of how the RC is structured and what the next steps are right now in the crisis.
Thank you. And I think, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think Peter also wanted to say something of UNDP. I mean, it's a very, very fair point that you're making. Now, and traditionally, the UN development system has been much more led at the country level. It's been very much everybody needs to kind of get organized at the country level and involve a broad set of partners and stakeholders. So, having worked several years at the country level in the resident coordinator's office, my main recommendation I can give is like proactively reach out to the resident coordinator. They will definitely welcome working with anybody on this and making sure that we have a much more holistic approach to what we're doing at the country level. There are several examples of resident coordinators, again, and that's always in tandem with UNDP, who have worked with youth groups to shape the socioeconomic assessment that happened in Ghana, for example. Working on in the Gulf, we've been working with some NGOs on the whole migration and migrant workers there and how to deal with that. There's a lot of examples out there. Now, there's also not one civil society community or one NGO. Also, my recommendation definitely is go directly to the resident coordinator and see how you can work together. They would be very welcome in building a broader platform and making sure that our responses are aligned and all going into the same direction. Over.
Thank you, Frederick. Peter, you would like to come in, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you, George and Frederick, for those very good inputs. I just wanted to pick up or connect both some of the inputs from George and also from Frederick on funding. I think we're seeing a very interesting and very challenging funding situation at the moment for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, as everybody's aware, many of the key bilateral donors are struggling themselves with their own financial and economic issues, and so people are predicting significant cuts in ODA levels from some of the major donors. And of course, linked to that is obviously political pressure on these donors to be seen to be allocating resources to the COVID response. And so a lot of agencies, both UN and NGOs, have been flagging the dangers that donors currently divert their existing ODA to the COVID response and therefore, of course, not maintain existing funding for critical both humanitarian and development programs, particularly in fragile states or states where we're seeing big reversals in the Gs. So there is a real challenge in terms of funding the overall funding for the COVID response, of course, not being sufficient, but also being potentially diverted away from the funding of existing critical programs. Secondly, as everybody's aware, the Global Humanitarian Response Appeal has been quite successful in mobilizing resources for the humanitarian response. But of course, as we know, this hasn't left much money left for the development response. And so we're seeing potentially a big shortfall in resources available for the socioeconomic response. And obviously it would be interesting to hear a bit from George and Frederick where they think potentially additional or new resources will come from. What is clear, of course, as Frederick was saying, is that very often it's at the country level that the resources are mobilized. And so one is hopeful that between national governments and also donors at the country level, there may still be resources being made available to address the COVID response. But that's an interesting question. And then finally, of course, picking up on some of George's points, it is clear also that the impacts of the COVID crisis on some fragile and crisis states is differentiated. And what we're seeing also, for example, is that the socioeconomic impacts of the COVID crisis are, in fact, in some cases, greater or more pressing than the health dimensions of the crisis. And as I think George was saying, we're also potentially seeing a series of waves of the crisis as well. And so the challenge for I think development actors will be that we are well positioned to help countries respond to those initial socioeconomic impacts, often linked to the lockdowns and the confinements and the collapse of economic activity. But then, of course, recurrent waves of both socioeconomic impacts, but potentially also larger health impacts that may find or result in a situation of a crisis on top of another crisis. And so, George, interesting to hear how the plan or the framework sort of is potentially trying to help countries be prepared for that, of these sort of successive waves of crises upon crises, sometimes happening all at the same time. Over.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you also for posing questions basically to UNDP. And it's worth for the participant knowing that Peter has a prominent role also in the OECD DAC INCAF, in the fragility component basically of the OECD. So the data is bringing our first hand basically. And he has, of course, a prominent role in the result group number 4 about the Nexus which I met not long ago. There is a question from Kabita. Kabita from Oxfam in Asia on DRR. Would you like to take the floor? All right. Maybe if you're taking the floor,
Hello.
you're muted or.
Can you hear me?
Very well. Loud and clear. Go ahead, Kabita. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. Actually, my question, I think it's mostly to George or from all of you, the presenter, you can answer. It's kind of generic, like what's your observation and suggestions for the developing countries, especially referring Asian countries, where the capacity of the government the governments are not sufficient to recover by themselves and need external help, especially in the COVID situation. So any suggestions or anything that you suggest? And also how UN is, and also along with its sister organizations, are planning to support the developing countries to overcome this situation, especially in the economic aspect. The third one is any recommendation still where the COVID situation is in a peak situation and some countries are still in lockdown. They need both financial, social protection as well as health system functioning. So they need support. So any suggestions or recommendation how they should interlink and integrate it to overcome this situation, because one is supplementing another one. Some places health is not working well because of financial situations, and some places people are not able to mitigate or prevent it because of social protection system. So yeah, anything. And the last one, sorry, is any arcs from the UNs or any arcs to the international financial institutions for any debt cancellation, especially to the poor country and developing country. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kabita. I see also that Nergis and George have posted something on the debt, but if they want to elaborate more, they're very welcome. George, Frederick, who wants to start? Also considering Peter's questions. Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in on the economic and on the debt side, and how we think about financing in the next few months. As you know, many of the projections that were made over the past few months that suggest a tremendous global economic recession, and also projections on poverty and on income drops, those are projections that are actually materializing over the next few months. So in the real world, the effects of the income loss are only starting right now. So the projection of the World Bank is between 80 and 100 million people going below the poverty line of $1.90, and 170 million people below the $5.50 poverty line. But we know that these will materialize over the next few months. And as we see that, we'll see more, if you will, action happening on the ground from governments. If they don't have the capacity to react, we'll see responses both on the social side, on the streets, if you will, through social conflict and on erosion of trust, but also on the fiscal and on the financial side. If governments do not have access to access to liquidity, which is now mostly in the hands of the IFIs, both the IMF and the World Bank, which have between them about $1 trillion of liquidity for the developing world. The question is, will that be enough when the time comes, when we see the size of the economic growth regress? The IMF projection is that we'll be losing about $6 trillion in the current crisis. So we know that there is no one-to-one compensation with what's being lost from the jobs, supply chains, export, trade, economic growth side. The key question for us is the human one. How do you compensate individual poor and vulnerable households at the country level? And that's where we're doing our own mapping. So the UNDP is doing mapping on vulnerabilities in each country, focusing on where we think the hotspots might be. As you know, The epicenter of the crisis has moved to Latin America right now, particularly Brazil, also Mexico, but we're seeing a rise in cases in India, in Pakistan, in Russia, in South Africa, across the board. So this is a moment in which that wave is still rising. New cases are still rising, and we haven't seen a plateau. So until we see that plateau, we'll still be in phase one, if you will, of the response. But I think, as the question suggests, phase two should be on our mind, which is how do we address the size of this for governments who are weak fiscally or also institutionally weak to respond, to provide response for a long-term crisis. We're only 3 months into this, but if we project 12, 18 months from now, we'll need even more resilience on the side of governments and of UN agencies and of NGOs and all of us who are partnering on this. So this is of grave concern to us. We think that the numbers don't do justice to what is happening on the ground, and that's why the sort of a decentralized approach is going to be important as we move in the local areas, in communities, in cities, in rural areas, and accompany governments that don't have the right capacity or weak state capacities to address these, or weak legitimacy to address what is a vast health and socioeconomic crisis in the making. Over to you, Marco.
Excellent, George. Thank you so much. Frederick, anything to complement what George just said?
No, I think George gave a really good answer. Maybe just to answer on the question of Peter on the funding. Absolutely true that the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, the humanitarian resources have been more successful at this stage than the development. That's again why I think the repurposing of, and when I actually talk about repurposing, I am talking about repurposing the development resources that we had as a UN system at the country level, but redirecting it to actions that are directly helping countries with the COVID-19 response. So it's not that we're using resources from humanitarian and moving it to development. It is within our development portfolio that we're realigning and make sure that our programs are more aligned to the COVID-19 response. And frankly, that there are some activities that we as a UN development system are not able to do because that we originally planned because we're working from home. It's much more difficult to do certain things. So that's one important element. The other element is that we had some existing multi-partner trust funds, as they are called, or one funds, both at the global and at the country level. And for example, the joint SDG fund, which is something that we in DCO are quite involved in. We actually also changed our focus, our next call for proposal, so that it is much more linked to address the COVID-19 impact. The joint SDG fund, I think we just received like a contribution of more than $100 million from Spain for the next 5 years. So part of that will also go to COVID-19. So it is a challenge, and that's why we're really trying to work with private sector, with foundations, working with global citizens to really create some kind of buzz around this. And hopefully we'll get some donations and working daily with different donors to ensure that we actually are able to mobilize this. If there's any more question on the World Bank, I don't know if Nergis, who is online, Nergis works in DCO and she's our World Bank expert. So Nergis, if there's anything you would like to add, feel free to intervene. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you, Frederick. Yeah, Nergis. Yes.
So very briefly, we are working with the World Bank in many countries. As you know, it's one of the institutions that we collaborate often, and they're also part of the big UN family. And our collaboration varies, of course, from country to country, and headquarters level also. There were some important discussions between our Deputy Secretary General and the Managing Director of Operations. So in some countries, they're involved in the UN country teams. In some, they're part of the socioeconomic response-related task forces, impact assessments. And we are also looking into how we can collaborate on various issues, advocating for important issues like making sure that the finance goes into the sectors and also countries and vulnerable groups where it's needed the most. So going forward, we will try to strengthen our collaboration with all international financial institutions. So the usual suspects are, of course, the IMF and the World Bank, but we are also collaborating with many MDBs that are big players in their respective regions. So this is a very unprecedented crisis. As you know, not this number of countries were knocking the doors of the IFIs at the same time. So in the chat box, there were some questions. So definitely in our discussions with the IFIs, that sustainability issues are also at the front of our concerns and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nargis. Yeah, is very, very interesting because a week ago or 2 weeks ago, we had a number of meetings with regional level or Geneva-based donors, the G14, I think they call themselves, and those were the donors with their humanitarian hat, if you want. And by answering to questions about funding, basically, they were in a way driving us in believing or understanding that their development counterpart were perceived from them as much more dynamic and successful in basically changing and adapting the portfolios and so on. Examples have been brought about the development side of the European Commission in Kenya that repurposed money that were basically in standby for large infrastructural programs, going now into the direct support to the ones farther behind, basically to the families that lost income and so on. Now here we hear basically that your position is humanitarian has been pretty much successful in raising money, although we are still, I think, around 18%, I guess, of the GHRP, and I think NGOs started to believe that we won't see a global humanitarian response plan being funded more than probably 30%, so even below the average of an HRP and so on. I see that Delphine from CARE, Delphine is the director of CARE in Geneva, has posted a similar question. Delphine, I'm wondering if you want to take the floor and elaborate a bit on that.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, yes, I think as I wrote, I do appreciate everything that's been said, but I'm just a bit concerned about having heard several times that we're doing well on the humanitarian appeal funding. I think there's definitely, yes, I mean, I'm not sure exactly where we are, but I think we're nearing the 2 billion in terms of funds raised, and maybe more by now. I have not seen the latest OCHA updates. But when we actually, I was just doing an analysis today. We were comparing, in fact, the funding percentages of the regional refugee response plans of the largest refugee crisis at this time of the year now compared to last year. And for each RRP, there is a significant difference, and the funding levels this year are much lower. And as you all know, there is definitely big concerns about the big existing humanitarian crises not being funded. So, you know, it's important that we also, of course, fund the more developmental recovery strategies that countries really need to to recover from the impacts of COVID. But at the same time, it's just always, what comes first. And I think as CARE, we really struggle, even in terms of our own advocacy. What do we need to be asking for first, given, as it was also rightly explained by one of our presenters, I think we are facing an unprecedented competition for resources. So I guess that's a bit the challenge. And yes, being, of course, in charge of humanitarian policy advocacy, I'm always concerned hearing that we're doing well with the humanitarian appeal, because in fact, that's not the case. Over.
Thank you, Delphine. I don't know if George, Frederick, even Peter or Agnese wants to pick this up. I have, I see probably Frederick. You seem ready to come in.
I just wanted to say absolutely right. I don't think it's going great. It's going better than the socioeconomic response on the humanitarian side, which does not mean that it's going well on the humanitarian side as well. So fully agree with the comments made. Over.
Thank you. George, anything from your side? No. All right.
I think Agnese wants to add something. Agnese is our humanitarian expert in DCO.
Agnese, come in, please. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Go ahead.
Yes. So maybe just to say, I also agree with Fred and Delphine. Maybe just to say, I know there are resources in general are limited, and so donors and member states have to prioritize what to finance first. But we really think instead of talking about competitions, it's important to talk about complementarity. So these socioeconomic responses are really meant to complement some of the immediate short-term responses that are needed and that need to take place at country levels and are coordinated as part of the GHRPs in those 63 countries that are included in the plan. So I think that's an important dimension, and this is how we should probably frame the discussion at country level too. And maybe just to add to some of the points that were raised actually earlier. We know many of your organizations actually, or most all of them, are indeed involved at the country level in contributing to humanitarian analysis and to design humanitarian response plans and operations. But indeed, it would be important, as Fred mentioned earlier, if you, as appropriate, of course, if you do reach out to the country teams, as we know you do have analysis and data as well at the country level. You often have consultations with affected communities and affected populations, and so you do have a sense of what people's needs on the ground are. And here I'm not only talking about short-term needs, but also longer-term needs and what the causes of these needs are. So it's quite important actually to for all of your organizations really to be working with our teams on the ground and share this information that you may have. Analysis too. Over.
Thank you, Agnese, for this contribution. I was also prompting the participants to post. There is still some time, a few minutes, to post maybe some more questions or to take the floor directly. Just notified for the sake of a little bit of orderly sequencing. Meanwhile, while people formulate their point, I was thinking, because you mentioned, and I think rightly so, there is an appreciation also from the NGOs that with the reform there is a little bit of more dynamism, or like agility, I think was the word that was used, in the UN. And I think the example of the repurpose of money, which is not a criticism to repurpose the money in a moment where there is no new money, according to donors, at least from their humanitarian side, to be agile enough to be able to repurpose is already a very good news. So probably it's an opportunity because you sit in a very relevant and prominent roles in the development part in the UN. If you have any kind of, because most of the participants are of course here attending this call with their humanitarian hat, if you want, but most they do represent organizations that are multi-mandated. They are very, very organized and performing in development, also able actually to mobilize an incredible amount of resources. I think the overall footprint of ICBA membership, including the development, is around 20 billions per year. So is quite a substantial amount of money. So I was wondering if from your point of view, there are recommendations for NGOs on how to interpret this phase, because many have been mentioning it as also an opportunity for change, basically, to change the business model of NGOs, to change the approach, to change the way we are structured in order to basically better deliver. So I think it's an opportunity, this very call, also to hear from you, your sincere, basically, thought. I'm sure that in your exchanges you have been thinking about not only about the UN and the governments, but also about the NGOs in the way that they are acting, performing. So, is there any kind of thought, recommendations, reflection that you would like to share with us while I wait for other questions, if any? Over.
Hi, Marco. It's a really interesting question. I don't know if I have a straightforward answer. I mean, and thanks for also reflecting on the agility of the UN development system. And I mean, as you know, we are changing continuously. I mean, the 2019 reforms is not the first reform, but it's definitely one of the more in-depth reforms where a lot of changes are to be done at the headquarters level, so that the country level is actually better positioned to do the work that they need to do. We're not only doing the reform at the development pillar, but it also we also have the management reform, mainly in the secretariat, and we also have the peace and security, and all of that. While independent pillars, they all interact very, very well together, and then linked with other reforms like gender parity and all of that. I think if you look at the UN development system, I think one of the 7 big pillars that we had was on partnerships, and so it's interesting to see how we have been working on that. Of course, as a UN, we are a member states organization. The government will remain our main partner, and we continue to work with the government on many areas, because ultimately that's the level where a lot of the work needs to happen, and that's where policy changes can happen. We've been pushing really hard to reach out to what we call the non-traditional partners, and the fact that we call them non-traditional is already a problem, because it kind of says that we don't have the tradition to work with them, while we actually should be working with them. So just in that language, we already see that we have a bit of an issue. And again, I think so. One of the big areas that we're working on is now private sector, because we also think that they can bring in some resources, but that's really the secondary reason. The main reason is that businesses have a big impact on countries and societies. The environmental footprint, the social footprint, the human rights footprint are quite big. So there we've been working quite close with civil society. It's always been a little bit more challenging, and I'm very honest here. I was based in Egypt for 4 years, just before and after the revolution, And we really wanted to work with civil society. And for example, when we did our common country analysis, we actually invited 200 civil society organizations to help us think through the challenges of the country and possible responses. Now that 200 was 0.0 something of the total NGOs in Egypt. I think they had at the time 21,000 in NGOs. So, and again, I'm speaking, even though this is recorded, I'm just brainstorming out loud and just giving some thought. I think if I really like the fact that this entity here is bringing already quite a lot of the bigger NGOs together, and maybe this is something that we need to replicate at the country level as well. I'm sure that a lot of resident coordinators would be very welcome to engage in discussions with a group of entities. It's sometimes not easy for us to find out who exactly should we be talking with. So again, I recommend reach out proactively. We know the bigger NGOs, but there's a lot of other NGOs that are doing amazing work. And I think the more we can work together, the better. And I think if you look at our the phases of our programming, I think on the analytical phase, that's really where we can work together, where NGOs can help to contribute to a better analysis. We've moved from where we normally hire a consultant. So that person comes in the country, talks with 5 people, writes a document and says, like, this is how the UN sees the country, to something much more robust with a strengthened capacity in the Office of the Resident Coordinator, working with all the UN country teams. In this case of the socio-economic impact analysis, UNDP has been a key driver, put their full weight behind this. So it's done much more internally within the UN. But at the same time, we had a much more we're much more open to external feedback from NGOs, from foundations, from NGOs, from private sector. So I think that there are indeed a lot of opportunities, and I think it will have to come from both ways. So reach out proactively. If there's anything that you wish us to share with the country level, we'd also be happy to do this. We're sending out daily update to the resident coordinators. If there's something that you think might be helpful for resident coordinators, happy to consider. And then also happy to continue to brainstorming on that if you would have some further thinking on this, because I strongly believe it is absolutely needed, especially now with the socioeconomic impact. The UN is not going to solve this by themselves. We hope that we are able to be a very big player, but we can't do it with the IFIs, we can't do it with private sector, we can't do it with the government in the driver's seat, and we can't do it with the civil society NGOs. Over.
Thank you so much, Frederick. And I think among the actors you were mentioning, there is also one dimension that probably I should have mentioned earlier. Is not only about individual NGOs, which of course are the operational arm in a way, is the ones that in the end carry out the work and so on. But there is a very, very important dimension, the country, at the regional, and in a way also at the global level, which is the NGO fora, which is basically the collective of NGOs. In most of the cases, in a number of cases, not necessarily most of the cases, those are like a collective that are mixed in nature, so they do embrace international and national NGOs, so they do interpretate every day in their work the different needs, different ways, and even business models that the organization do have. So this is, I think, a perfect way to introduce Fiona, who is Fiona Gall, is the director of ACBAR, which is a very old or rather mature and very reputed NGO for mixed, embracing both national and international in Afghanistan. Fiona, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marco, and good afternoon to everybody. I think my question was really, for us, the big headache as an NGO forum is getting the donors together to agree on things. And I think the UN now is working very hard in Afghanistan on a one UN plan, especially the COVID plan as well. And they can have some relations with government, but some of the donors, like the World Bank, say to us, we can't really work with you directly because we are obliged to work through government. So we have this sort of position where we can give advice and do backseat or behind scenes discussions, but we're not really at the table when it comes to planning and designing things. And so we have to do everything through the UN or in a circuitous way. So I really sometimes think we could shorten these complications and just all sit down together. But that obviously also depends on the government if they're very sensitive to having too much pressure from civil society directly in the discussions. I don't know if you find that also in where you are. Over.
Thank you, Fiona. Before giving back the floor, maybe I can group a couple of other questions. There is Delphine again from CARE, but also Chikezi that would like to come in. So please, if you can come in, so we can group the three questions and go for a set of answers before we approach the end of the session. Over.
Thank you, Marco. My comment is perhaps a reaction to Frederic, and really welcome. It was music to my ears, Frederic, when you were thinking aloud, as you said, about the importance of listening to the voice of civil society organizations. I think, in 2020, after everything we've learned about development aid and the importance of diversity, the importance, right now, the big topics around the recovery post-COVID, it's actually climate justice, it's a green recovery, it's a gender just recovery. And I think in order to make sure that we can achieve all of that, it's absolutely critical that civil society organizations are heard and that they can contribute to the shaping, the engineering of whatever strategies we think need to be implemented to recover. So, perhaps it's because, if I very, very honestly, you've been candid with us, and I think we should be with you, when the socioeconomic framework was actually shared, it was for many of my colleagues in countries that at least should have been having some level of awareness that this was happening. It came really as a big surprise. We didn't know that this was actually developed. And when you said it was a bottom-up process, perhaps it was bottom-up, but I think it was fairly exclusive and maybe bottom-up within the UN system and with governments, but certainly not with CSOs. And I think it's a missed opportunity. It's not too late. And I would really encourage that perhaps, guidelines like LOCOC, the humanitarian coordinator did for the GHRP, he sent very clear guidelines at some point to the humanitarian coordinators to say you really need to make sure that NGOs sit at the table. Maybe something similar. We know also the risk, of course, is that in some countries where you work and where supporting these processes, the governments themselves may very deliberately not want to have NGOs at the table. And as a UN system, of course, it's a responsibility to ensure that we don't get manipulated into these practices, right? So I just wanted to encourage you, Frederic, to go ahead with implementing what you're thinking, and we're happy to think with you through networks like ICVA and others, or ACBAR, and that are already there, because we do hear your challenge about you can never perhaps fully consult. Civil society is diverse, but there is already a level of organization of civil society in countries that can be helpful to you for these consultations and to have a more inclusive process. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphine. I think very important. It's not too late for involvement to recommend from the top to RC, or to remind them about the importance of involvement that would go a long way forward. Chikezi, do you like to come in?
Yes, I'd like to come in here, and greetings to everyone. I also work at the at DCO with Fred and Agnese. I lead on partnerships, and I've been listening quietly, and a lot of this discussion it sounds music to my ears. I just want to kind of reiterate or reinforce some of the things that Fred had mentioned as some of the, if you want to call it, the vision or and challenges we face as the reforms of the UN development system unfolds. Just to give you a quick background, I mean, much of my life has been with the NGO sector. I just joined the UN last year. I worked for ActionAid, Save the Children and Planet at different times in my life, and I know what you're all talking about. But you know, in all honesty, I think there are a lot of opportunities right now with the reforms for civil society engagement, and I would like to reinforce that our wish and desire would be that we have more platforms like this where we can begin to, get civil society a lot more involved in the UN processes and entities. I don't want to belabor the issue that, yes, governments most of the time don't want civil society on board, but I think there are a lot of opportunities. Fred had talked about the common country analysis, and I think for us at the UN level, if we hear a lot more of NGO voices, perspectives, and views in those analyses, it will help strengthen the engagement and the delivery. I quite agree with Delphine that governments will not want NGOs at all the tables, and we must be alive to that reality. However, I think that NGOs holding governments accountable even for what they've agreed to is a very key component of what a lot of the NGOs could be contributing to this whole process. And like it's been mentioned, the social economic framework is an additional component or process whereby NGOs can hold duty bearers and governments accountable to what they have actually committed themselves to. So for me, my real contribution is, how can we expand this? Yes, this is happening and organizing well around humanitarian issues. I know also in the wider development sector, Oxfam is here, CARE is here. So many of these NGOs here already have colleagues and programs in the wider development sector. My real appeal is, how do we begin to connect it all so that we're all speaking the same language? We're all having a good platform for sharing information, which is what I hear, that there's a need for a lot more information flow between the UN and civil society actors on the ground so that they know when these things are happening to be able to make meaningful contribution. We don't have all the answers. That's one of the things I've learned and found in the few months I've spent in the UN. And to be honest, I think at the stage where the UN is right now with the reform, there are a lot of opportunities. The UN is really willing and hungry to engage civil society, but I think what we need to really look for and work together on is the entry points where we can come together. And one final word, I think there is a lot of work we all need to do to strengthen capacity and organizing at national level. Resident coordinators would respect and accept organized civil society who know what they're talking about on all the issues to come to the table, even if we're not with government, but with the UN processes. I just like to chip that in over, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Oh, thank you so much. You waited, but it was so important to hear from you. I mean, very, very insightful. I think we're approaching really the end of the minutes of the time that we had planned. So if anyone wants to take the floor for some very last and burning issues, is welcome to do so. I think one of the Frederick, go ahead.
I just wanted to react to the first speaker of the last series. I forgot the name, Delphine, or maybe it doesn't matter. About the fact that a lot of these things are government-led processes. I just wanted to clarify that our common country analysis is meant to be an independent analysis. Very often the government is involved, but it's one of the few documents that we actually are not asking the government to sign, because we really want this to be the independent analysis that is our view on what is really going on in the country level. And that's also why you see since we released a new guidance, it is a lot more critical than before, which I'm going to put it a little bit black and white here. Very often was a copy paste of the national plan, and in many cases it still will be. But that means that the national plan is probably also taking into account the whole normative agenda, the whole human rights element, gender, all of that. So I think, again, at the common country analysis, there are opportunities for civil society to engage. On the socioeconomic framework, and George was much more involved on the development of that. I think the main focus of that framework is what can the UN contribute to tackle the consequences of the socioeconomic impact, or how will our response look like? And we made references that we need to do this together with others, but it was not necessarily meant to be something similar what you have in the humanitarian world. Now, that being said, your message is very well taken. I think the easiest way to move this forward is at the country level. Engage with the resident coordinators. We'll be happy to facilitate where we can. At headquarters level, I'm not 100% sure we actually have plans on that, or if there's any thinking. I noted it down, and I'll discuss further internally. I definitely think it's interesting ideas, and happy to engage in further discussions in the futures. And I just see that Fiona is asking if the common country analysis is mandatory. It is absolutely mandatory for all UN country teams undergoing their new cooperation framework. So it is a mandatory step, and we actually also have a peer review mechanisms that we go through it and send it back if we don't think it is sufficient. It's an interagency effort. Regional level is heavily involved to provide further input, and as I said, it is meant to also bring in the voice of the most vulnerable, of civil society, of other partners. Over.
Thank you so much, Frederick. I was wondering, George, do you have any final comment before I can't wrap up. I don't have the time nor the ambition in this moment. We need some time to digest all the information, but for sure, if you have a final comment, it would be appreciated.
Well, just to thank you, Marco and colleagues. I think it was a great session to hear and to listen in. Thank you for sharing your concerns and ideas, and thank you for allowing us to share what we've got on the socioeconomic assessments and on the rollout. And I added a couple of links for the future if you want to take a look at country-specific assessments coming out. We update this list pretty much every day, every week, and we'll have another 50, 60 assessments coming online over the next 30 days. So I encourage you to take a look at that. DCO and UNDP are working together on creating sort of a common library on this, and working together on guidance for country offices. So great if you can reach out either to us or to DCO, and we're working hand in glove. Thank you again. Thank you, Marco. Over.
Thank you, George. Thank you for these words. Really, it's impossible to wrap up in this moment. We have the recording. We will try to probably to summarize a few of the key questions that have been questioned, and of course answers and insights that you proposed to us. One of the important things that I take with me is because we are talking and we are representing a humanitarian crew from the NGO side, is the importance and the critical role of the governments. And we know that in many of the contexts we are working, the governments may be subjects to the conflict that are going on. And there are some criticalities that have been accompanying all the conversation around the Nexus. I think there has been some consensus in the Nexus conversation around trying to go also beyond the country level, the capital level, but to go at the sub-national level in order to find the niches where engagement with governments is possible or where it is not. Unfortunately, there are situations where it is not possible. So you will see some of these of the NGOs disengaging in a way, but there are many contexts where it's possible in the same country, and NGOs will be able in a way to be there and to provide room for coordination and so on. I think another element we took is the importance of early involvement of the civil society, and again the cruciality beyond the jokes on the chat, the cruciality of NGO4 as a collective in order to find a way to engage with the civil society in the right manner. I think NGO4 will confirm from the country level, the regional level, as much as the global, their willingness to be at the table to discuss and to share and to squeeze the brains together. Other than that, I think George, Frederick, Nergis, Agnese, Chikezi, and everybody really in the call, thank you so much for the frankness, the openness. I think we have much appreciated it. Really, for us is a sort of door that we have opened, and thanks to Agnese, which was our entry point, if you want, in order to organize this. We know that we are extremely busy, and the participants are extremely busy as well. So thank you for the time you dedicated to this. I was also impressed by the capacity you had, guys, to articulate very complex subjects and then have a look to the chat in order to answer live, basically, to questions. It's just an amazing skill that we are developing in these times of virtual communications and so on. I think we were good. With just 3 minutes of delay, we can close this session and probably wait for and stay tuned in order to maybe update ourselves in a couple of months, probably when there will be meet to discuss around that. Thank you really sincerely very much. This session is now over.
Thank you very much. Talk to you soon.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you again. Bye bye.
Thank you.